The moment Officer Jake Lawson hit the pavement, time seemed to fracture. 1 second he was shouting commands through his radio. The next his world exploded in a burst of pain. The bullet tore through his side, just beneath his vest, and the impact knocked him flat on his back in the middle of the intersection. Sirens screamed from every direction, tires screeched, and voices shouted, but all of it blurred into a distant roar. Blood seeped rapidly through his uniform, spreading beneath him like a dark shadow on the concrete. His breaths came short and ragged. The pain was sharp, but what frightened him more was the sudden cold. He blinked up at the sky, vision swimming, somewhere beyond the chaos. He heard the sound of claws scraping pavement. Then a familiar weight landed beside him. Shadow, his canine partner, a 6-year-old Belgian Malinois trained for detection, protection, and loyalty beyond measure, lowered himself beside Jake's trembling body. The dog's chest heaved, ears twitching at every sound, but his eyes stayed fixed on Jake. He nudged Jake's shoulder gently with his nose, then let out a low, guttural whine. Crowds gathered around the scene, phones out, recording everything. Patrol cars formed a perimeter. Officers shouted to secure the area. A paramedic rushed forward, bag in hand, but Shadow let out a sudden bark that made the man freeze. The dog positioned himself protectively over Jake's chest, snarling now. He wasn't just defending his handler. He was refusing to let anyone near him. "Stand down," an officer called, recognizing the dog. "Let them through, Shadow." But Shadow didn't move. He had been trained to obey, trained to follow commands. But right now, all of that training warred against instinct, and instinct was winning. His partner was dying. Shadow could smell at the bitter metallic scent of blood, the shallow breathing, the flickering heartbeat, and he wasn't going to lose him. Not now. Not like this. Jake tried to lift his hand. It barely moved an inch. "Let them help," he whispered, the words lost in his throat. Shadow looked down at him, whining again, torn between duty and devotion. He didn't step aside. Instead, he barked once, loud and commanding, not at the paramedics, not at the crowd, at the world itself. As if daring it to take his partner away, more officers arrived. One of them, Sergeant Collins, knelt a few feet away. "Shadow, it's okay, buddy. We're here to help Jake. Let us." Shadow growled low, his body trembling. His eyes darted between Collins and Jake, still unmoving and growing paler by the second. And then a hand, Jake's hand, slick with blood, reached up and touched Shadow's neck. "Good boy," he rasped, barely audible. "I'm okay." It wasn't true. He wasn't okay. He was fading fast. But those words, spoken in a voice Shadow had followed into gunfire and darkness, were enough. The dog shifted slightly, still hovering close, but allowed the medics to kneel beside Jake and begin their work. As they tore open his uniform and pressed gauze to the wound, Shadow circled restlessly, never leaving Jake's side. He barked at one of the cameramen who got too close. He growled when a bystander shouted. His tail stayed low and his ears pinned back, alert, protective, waiting for a threat he couldn't see but knew was near. Inside the ambulance, as Jake was lifted onto the stretcher, Shadow jumped up too. One of the EMTs moved to stop him, but the sergeant raised a hand. "Let him ride. He's earned that much." Blood pooled on the stretcher. Jake's breathing was thin and unsteady. The heart monitor beeped erratically. Shadow laid his head next to Jake's shoulder, watching every rise and fall of his chest. The hospital staff was ready when they arrived, but Shadow wasn't. As the doors flew open and they rushed Jake inside, he was held back at the entrance by security. He fought the leash, snarling and barking, his claws scraping the tile. They weren't just taking Jake away. They were taking his purpose. 2 officers stayed behind with Shadow, trying to calm him down. But he didn't calm. He sat by that door for hours, unmoving, unblinking. Every sound made his ears perk. Every stretcher that rolled by, he sniffed the air. Every nurse's footsteps made him rise, only to sit again in disappointment. In the waiting room, officers sat silently. The one who'd found Jake first was still shaking. "I didn't even see where the shot came from," he muttered. "1 minute we were clearing the street, and the next." Collins sat nearby, Staring at the blood on his boots, he pushed the kid out of the way, took the bullet instead. Silence followed, and still, Shadow waited. His eyes locked on the swinging doors that separated him from the only human he had ever trusted. Doctors moved quickly inside the trauma room, internal bleeding, blood pressure dropping. They worked in silence, efficiently, but nothing was certain. Nothing was promised. Jake was losing the fight, and outside, Shadow seemed to know it. He stood again, pacing, tail twitching, his ears pinned back, his nose lifted, sniffing the air like he could smell what was happening behind those walls. He whined once long, low and mournful. The sergeant looked over. That dog's not just a partner. He's Jake's shadow. If Lawson doesn't make it, he didn't finish the sentence, because none of them could say it out loud. And none of them knew that what would happen next, what Shadow would do in the... Jake Lawson's body felt like it was underwater, the weight of the world pressing down on him, suffocating him slowly. The cold that had crept in at first had taken over, leaving his limbs stiff and unresponsive. His mind was a haze, as if reality itself had started to fracture, breaking into pieces he couldn't hold onto. He felt like he was slipping, like his body was no longer his own. Yet through it all, there was one constant shadow. The canine refused to leave his side. As the medical team worked frantically, Shadow stood still, his gaze locked onto Jake's face. There were no commands to follow, no instructions to obey. There was only one thing he knew in that moment: he couldn't let his partner slip away. Not without a fight. Despite the chaos of the emergency room, Shadow stayed as close as he could, held back only by the walls and doors that separated him from Jake. His nails clicked against the tile floor as he paced back and forth. Every now and then, he would whine softly, his ears twitching at the sound of every movement, every voice that drifted through the crack under the door. Inside the trauma room, the doctors worked tirelessly, their hands moving in a blur. IVs were inserted, machines beeped, and oxygen was pumped into Jake's lungs. But the blood loss was severe. He was slipping. The pulse in his neck was barely there, his body failing despite their best efforts. But outside, in the sterile, quiet hallway, Shadow's attention never wavered. He stayed near the door, his body taut with tension. He was silent, but his presence was loud, like a storm waiting to break. His head turned toward the door with every noise, his tail stiff behind him. A nurse approached him cautiously, trying to coax him into a seat in the waiting area. "It's okay, boy. Your partner's going to be all right." Her voice was soft, but Shadow only stared at her for a moment before growling low in his throat, his stance unchanged. She backed away slowly, understanding that the bond between this canine and the officer was something far beyond simple obedience. It was loyalty, pure and raw, the kind of loyalty that didn't need words. Then, just as the tension seemed unbearable, the doors to the trauma room opened. Jake's body was wheeled out, his condition still critical. The monitors attached to him beeped rapidly, his vitals unstable. His face was pale, and his chest rose and fell shallowly. Shadow surged forward, as if he could sense the change in the air. The guards tried to stop him, but Shadow didn't flinch. He broke through the restraint, rushing toward Jake. He leapt onto the stretcher, his paws on the edge, his nose pressed against Jake's face. "Get him off," one of the nurses shouted. "We need space. Get that dog back." But Jake's hand, shaking and weak, found its way to Shadow's head. With a faint, barely audible murmur, he whispered, "Stay with me." It wasn't a command. It wasn't a request. It was a plea. And Shadow, who had seen his partner face down criminals, walk into dangerous situations without hesitation, heard the pain in his voice and knew what was at stake. For the first time since this nightmare began, the team gave in. They allowed Shadow to stay by Jake's side as they rushed him into surgery. Hours passed, but Shadow did not move. He lay in the waiting area, his body stiff with anxiety, his eyes never leaving the door. The officers who had gathered around were quiet, too. They exchanged looks, but no one spoke. What could they say? Jake was a fighter. He had always been a fighter. But this was different. A doctor stepped into the waiting room, his face somber. The air seemed to grow thicker as every eye turned toward him, desperate for any kind of news. "How is he?" one officer asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The doctor hesitated for a moment before answering. "He's stable for now. We've done all we can, but it's still touch and go. He's lost a lot of blood. His chances of making it are uncertain." There was a collective sigh in the room, but no one dared to speak. They had all seen men like Jake come back from impossible situations, but this felt different. The doctor left them in silence, and for a moment, the only sound was the quiet whine that escaped from Shadow. Shadow's tail was between his legs now, his head low. His eyes darted from the door back to the officers in the room, a look of helplessness in them that no canine should ever have to carry. He had been there through countless arrests, through shootouts, through everything. But now, he was powerless. And in that moment, as the night stretched on, Shadow's patience wore thin. He began to pace again, his movements erratic. The anxiety that had built up in him throughout the ordeal began to manifest in full force. He needed to be with Jake. He needed to know that his partner was alive. A quiet voice interrupted the stillness. "Maybe it's time we talk to the family." No one moved. No one responded. They couldn't, because they all knew one thing: they weren't ready to give up. Not yet. Then, just as the silence threatened to consume them, a low rumble echoed through the hallway. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder, more persistent. Shadow froze. His ears perked up. The sound. It was coming from behind the doors. Jake's heartbeat had been stable for a while now, but now something was happening. The machines began to beep. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor shifted, gaining strength, gaining speed. And just like that, hope surged. Shadow barked, his tail wagging furiously. His body shot toward the doors. He didn't wait for anyone's permission. The doors burst open, and just as Jake's vitals began to stabilize, the moment of silence was broke. The days that followed felt like an eternity. Jake Lawson lay unconscious in a sterile hospital bed, surrounded by machines that beeped relentlessly, keeping track of a life that seemed to hang by a thread. Shadow remained at the door, always near, never straying far from the room. The officers who had stayed behind, watching him, saw the same intensity in his eyes, an intensity that spoke of a bond that no one could truly understand unless they had witnessed it firsthand. In the quiet of the hospital, the halls often echoed with the soft click of Shadow's claws as he paced. He refused to leave Jake's side for more than a few minutes, only when absolutely necessary. When the nurses arrived to check on Jake's condition, Shadow was there staring at them with a gaze that, despite its calmness, seemed to demand answers. He'd never been so still, his every movement weighed down by a sense of duty, of responsibility. He could have moved on, found a bed, rested like any other dog, but he didn't. He couldn't. Jake's recovery, though slow, began to show signs of hope. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic in their reports. His blood pressure had stabilized, and his heart rate, once erratic, was now steady. But still, no one could guarantee anything. No one could promise that Jake would walk out of this hospital as the man he once was. The trauma had been immense, both physically and mentally. The weight of what he had endured was more than just the blood loss. It was the realization that his life had been forever altered in a split second. A single moment had changed everything, and that's where Shadow came in. The K9's presence was more than just a comfort. It was a lifeline. Every time Jake's eyes fluttered open, the first thing he saw was Shadow, lying quietly beside his bed, his head resting on the floor, just inches from Jake's hand. When Jake reached out, even in his drugged haze, his fingers would always find Shadow's fur. And with that small connection, that small sign of life, a flicker of hope would ignite in Jake's chest. He wasn't alone, not now. Not ever. But despite Shadow's constant vigilance, the doctors remained on edge. His condition was still critical. They had performed emergency surgeries to stop the internal bleeding, but there was no guarantee the damage wasn't permanent. Every time they checked on him, every time they monitored his vitals, there was a nervous energy in the room. The nurses would exchange glances, their words unspoken but clear. Jake was a fighter, but the fight wasn't over, and outside the room, a different battle was being fought. The hospital was crowded with officers who had come to show support. There were patrol cars parked along the front, and the parking lot overflowed with colleagues, family members, and friends who had heard the news. They all wanted to offer their help, to lend a hand in any way they could. But it was clear that no one knew what to say. No one knew how to approach the idea of losing one of their own, especially when it was Jake, someone who had been a friend, a mentor, a brother to so many. Collins was there, standing in the waiting room, a coffee cup in his hand. His face was tired, worn. He hadn't left the hospital since the shooting. Neither had anyone else who had been involved in the incident. The officers who had responded to the scene, the paramedics who had rushed in, all of them waited. Some were hopeful, some were resigned, and some were simply numb. "He's not going to make it, is he?" one officer asked, his voice breaking the silence. He was younger, his uniform still pristine, his eyes filled with worry. He had been the one to pull Jake's body from the wreckage of the car that had hit him. Collins didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip of his coffee, staring out the window. The rain outside had started again, falling in sheets, a mirror to the somber mood inside the hospital. "He's a fighter," Collins finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't survive what he's been through by giving up." The officer nodded, but it was clear he was still unsure. "But what if he can't make it?" "Then we fight for him," Collins replied, his gaze hardening. "We fight for him just like he's fought for us all these years." Inside the hospital room, Shadow was waiting. His eyes were fixed on the door, his body tense, his tail still. He had sensed the change in the air, the way the officers outside were shifting. He could feel it, even if he didn't understand it. The uncertainty had settled in, like a cloud hanging over everything. Jake was stable, but there were still so many unknowns. Every time his heart rate dipped, every time his breathing became labored, Shadow's ears would prick up. He would pace, back and forth, his nails clicking on the tile floor as he moved restlessly. His bond with Jake was more than just loyalty, it was survival, and Shadow refused to let his partner slip away. The door to Jake's room opened, and a doctor stepped in. He had a clipboard in his hands, his eyes scanning Jake's vitals. But it was clear that even he was wary. No one wanted to make a prediction. No one wanted to be wrong. Shadow's eyes locked onto the doctor, his body rigid as he stood in place. The doctor paused for a moment, meeting the dog's gaze. There was something in the canine's eyes, something fierce, something unyielding. He could feel the energy in the room, the way it shifted. It wasn't just the officers who cared about Jake. It was everyone who had worked with him, lived with him, and fought beside him. They all knew that this wasn't just a man's fight, it was a fight for everything he stood for. And as the doctor began to speak to the officers outside the room, Shadow's eyes never left Jake. His paws shifted slightly, as if preparing to move, but he held still, watching, waiting. Then, a soft sound broke through the tension, a breath. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Shadow perk up. His ears twitched, his body shifting forward. The soft sound of Jake's breath was the first sign of life that he'd heard in hours. A heartbeat, a flicker, a spark of hope. It wasn't over, not yet, not by a long shot. The nights in the hospital had started to blend together. Days stretched into one another with little distinction. The hours ticking by in silence as Jake Lawson fought, and Shadow waited. Shadow hadn't left his side for days, not even for a moment. His loyalty was palpable, an invisible force in the sterile air of the ICU. The officers who took shifts outside Jake's room often stopped to watch, marveling at the bond between man and dog. It wasn't just a partnership, it was a relationship built on years of shared experiences, of saving each other's lives, of trusting each other with everything. And now, as Jake lay unconscious, slipping in and out of awareness, Shadow remained the only constant. The doctors had delivered their latest update hours earlier, a grim report that did little to ease the tension. Jake was still alive, yes, but his recovery was uncertain. He wasn't responding the way they hoped he would. His injuries were extensive, the damage to his internal organs serious. Yet, somehow, he clung to life, his heartbeat steady but weak, his breath labored. Outside the room, the officers who had gathered, those who had known Jake the longest, began to talk. It had been a long few days. Tired eyes met one another in solemn silence, and no one dared to speak the words they all feared. The fear of losing Jake was becoming too much to ignore. Do we prepare ourselves?" one officer finally asked, his voice heavy. He had been with Jake through countless shifts, through countless moments of danger. Jake was his partner, his friend, and now there was a quiet understanding that no matter how strong a man was, there were limits. "We don't give up," another officer replied, his tone firm. His voice, though exhausted, held a conviction that no one could deny. Jake had taught them that. He had taught them never to give up, no matter the odds. Back in Jake's room, Shadow paced in the corner, his movements restless as he watched the door. The hospital was quieter now, the usual bustle of activity that filled the hallways growing distant. It was past midnight, and the world outside seemed to have slowed to a crawl. But inside that room, time felt as though it was stretching, one slow moment after another. Shadow could sense it. There was something in the air, something different tonight. The beeping of the machines continued, steady but distant, as if they too were growing tired of the waiting. The hum of the lights overhead was the only constant sound, the only thing that reminded Shadow he wasn't alone. But his gaze remained fixed on Jake. His partner had been in more pain than anyone should endure, but he was still here. He wasn't gone yet, and as long as he wasn't, Shadow wasn't going anywhere. The door opened slowly, and a nurse stepped in. She paused when she saw Shadow, her eyes softening as she noticed the dog's posture, his stillness. "You've been here a while, haven't you?" she murmured, kneeling beside him. She reached out to pat his head, but Shadow didn't move. His eyes never left Jake. She sighed, standing back up. "He's a fighter too, isn't he?" A soft growl rumbled in Shadow's throat, barely audible, but enough to make the nurse take a step back. He didn't like the intrusion. The bond between Jake and Shadow was deeper than words could describe, deeper than anything anyone else could understand. This wasn't just a job for Shadow. This was his purpose. Jake's survival was his mission. And tonight, that mission would be tested. Jake's breathing grew heavier, more strained. The monitor by his bed began to beep at irregular intervals, a sign that something was wrong. Shadow's head jerked up immediately, his ears flat against his head, his body stiff. He had heard it, the change in the rhythm, the sudden inconsistency that could mean only one thing. Jake was slipping again. The nurse moved quickly to the machine, adjusting the dials, her hands moving with practiced precision. "Stay with him," she whispered, as if speaking to both Jake and Shadow. But it wasn't just the nurse's words that held power. It was the bond that tied them together, Jake, Shadow, and the fight to survive. Outside the room, the officers had gathered, watching through the glass, their faces a mix of hope and fear. They knew it was coming, the moment when they would have to face the harsh truth, but they couldn't think of that now. Not while Jake was still here, not while there was still a chance. A sound broke the stillness. It was a quiet noise at first, barely noticeable, but then it grew louder. The beeping of the monitor quickened, rising in pitch as it registered a dangerous change. Jake's heart rate spiked, then dropped. The irregular pattern was unmistakable. It wasn't good. "Code Blue," a voice echoed from the hallway. The sudden urgency was palpable, the panic in the air. Nurses and doctors flooded into the room, their movements swift and coordinated. Shadow remained still, his body rigid with tension. His eyes followed every movement, every action the doctors took. He understood. He knew. The officers in the hallway could hear the chaos inside the room. They could see the blur of movement through the glass, but they couldn't enter. They could only wait. And they knew, deep down, that if Jake was going to make it, they had to trust in the one thing they could all believe in, the bond between Jake and Shadow. Jake's body was still, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic breaths. The doctors worked frantically, but the light in his eyes was gone. His body was slipping further into unconsciousness. And Shadow, ever the protector, watched as if he had seen it all before, his expression one of quiet determinatio. But then, just when it seemed as though all hope had faded, the door burst open again. The nurse who had been with Jake rushed in, her voice sharp, demanding attention. "He's stabilizing," she shouted. The officers in the hallway looked at each other, their hearts skipping a beat. Was this it? Was Jake going to make it? Shadow stood and walked to the side of the bed, his eyes never leaving his partner. Jake's breathing was still faint, but it was there. The monitor's beeping slowed, becoming steadier, more rhythmic. And then, just as it seemed like the worst was over, Jake's hand twitched, slowly reaching out toward Shadow. The canine's ears pricked up, and his tail gave a slight, almost imperceptible wag. Jake's fingers brushed against his fur, a simple touch, but it was enough. Jake wasn't giving up, and neither was Shadow. It wasn't just the machines that held Jake together. It wasn't just the doctors or the nurses or the officers who had come to show their support. It was the unshakable bond between a man and his canine, something that even death could not break. The light in Jake's eyes flickered back to life, and Shadow knew that his mission wasn't over. Not yet.